Mark Thompson had spent 20 years protecting Savannah National Park. 2 decades of sunrises over endless golden grass, of tracking poachers through the night, of witnessing nature's beauty and brutality in equal measure. He thought he'd seen everything the Savannah had to offer. He was wrong. It started like any other patrol day. The morning sun cast long shadows across the plains as Mark's vehicle bounced along the familiar dirt tracks. He was mentally planning his route when a small shadow suddenly leapt directly into his path. Mark's instincts kicked in immediately. He slammed the brakes hard, and dust exploded in all directions, creating a cloud that momentarily obscured everything. When the dust settled and Mark stepped out of his vehicle, his breath caught in his throat. An albino lion cub lay collapsed on the ground, barely moving. The little creature was covered in wounds, deep gashes across its tiny body that were still bleeding. But what struck Mark most wasn't the injuries. It was the cub's eyes. The baby lion was gasping for breath, its small body trembling with effort as it raised one paw and pointed desperately in a specific direction. Those eyes held something Mark had never seen in 2 decades of working with wildlife: a desperate, intelligent plea. This wasn't an animal seeking help for itself. This cub was begging him to save someone else. Mark didn't hesitate. He ran in the direction the cub had indicated, his heart pounding harder with each step. What he discovered made his blood run cold. A massive albino male lion was charging toward another baby cub with deadly intent. Between them stood a lioness, her body covered in wounds and blood, using herself as a living shield to protect her remaining baby. Her legs were shaking from exhaustion and blood loss, but she stood firm, refusing to move even as the male closed in for another attack. Mark understood immediately what he was witnessing. This was infanticide, the new dominant male eliminating the previous king's offspring to ensure only his genes survived. It was nature's cruel law, played out across the animal kingdom since the beginning of time. The most fundamental principle of ranger work echoed in Mark's mind. Never interfere with nature's order. No matter how brutal, no matter how painful to watch, humans must not disrupt the natural balance. It was the first lesson taught to every ranger, the rule that governed everything they did. But then the wounded baby lion looked directly at him. In those desperate eyes, Mark suddenly saw himself. He was 8 years old again, standing in the rain on that terrible summer night. His stepfather's words still echoed across the decades. "Get out of my house." He remembered the feel of fists, the shock of being thrown out, the cold rain soaking through his thin clothes. He remembered trembling on the street corner, begging for help, watching people walk past without stopping. No one had reached out to him that night. No one had cared. That helplessness, that desperate hope that someone, anyone, would choose to protect him, had eventually led Mark to become a ranger. He'd spent 20 years believing that someone had to stand up and protect the vulnerable. Now he stood at the crossroads between his principles and a life hanging in the balance. Mark realized something in that moment. Principles are important, but nothing is more important than life itself when it's right in front of you. He sprinted back to his vehicle and grabbed the firecracker gun. His hands trembled as he raised it. But when he pulled the trigger, his eyes were absolutely unwavering. The explosive crack split the air across the savannah. The massive male lion froze mid-charge and slowly turned his head. His eyes locked with Mark's, and in that gaze, Mark saw something that chilled him. This wasn't just a beast acting on instinct. This was an intelligent being, a seasoned survivor who could calculate risks and assess threats with deadly precision. The male lion's entire demeanor shifted. His predatory focus changed as he recognized the danger. Attacking or killing a ranger could bring the entire Park Service down on the pride. Other rangers, vehicles, possibly even relocation or worse. The risk was too high. A heavy silence fell over the savannah. The male lion glared at the lioness and cubs one final time, his body tense with frustrated rage. Then slowly, deliberately, he turned away. But before disappearing into the tall grass, he stopped and looked back at Mark, letting out a low, rumbling growl. It was a warning, a promise. This isn't over. Once the male lion vanished completely, Mark rushed to the cubs. The situation was dire. The first cub had a deep wound on his front leg, muscle and tissue exposed. The second had a severe injury along his side, likely from the male lion's claws. Without immediate treatment, they wouldn't survive the day. Mark carefully loaded both cubs into his vehicle, moving as gently as possible despite the urgency. Then he glanced back at the lioness. She stood at a distance, watching him with eyes that held unbearable pain. She took a few hesitant steps toward the vehicle where her babies lay, then stopped. Her head slowly turned in the direction where the male lion had disappeared, back toward the pride where her other cubs waited. Mark understood completely. She had no choice. To protect her other offspring who remained with the pride, she had to return. If she abandoned them, they would die. But if she stayed with these two, all of them would die when the male lion returned. The lioness looked at the vehicle one last time. In her eyes, Mark saw both a plea and an extraordinary trust in this human she barely knew. Then she turned and disappeared into the grassland. Back at his ranger cabin, Mark worked through the night. He cleaned the wounds with warm water, applied disinfectant to prevent infection, and carefully wrapped them in clean bandages. The smaller cub needed an antibiotic injection. Mark had to hold him steady as he administered it, whispering reassurances to the frightened animal. For days, Mark barely slept. He fed the cubs with bottles, changed their bandages, monitored their temperatures. The wounds were severe, but the cubs possessed a remarkable will to survive. Slowly, day by day, they began to recover. On the seventh night, Mark woke to chaos outside. The screaming calls of hyenas surrounded the cabin, a hunting pack, drawn by the scent of vulnerable prey. He grabbed his gun and rushed to the window. What he saw stopped him cold. An albino lioness was fighting the hyena pack with ferocious intensity, driving them back from the cabin. It was the mother. She had returned. Mark's chest tightened with emotion as he understood what this meant. She knew she couldn't take her cubs back to the pride. If she tried, the male lion would kill them immediately, but she couldn't abandon them either. So she had made an impossible choice: survive with the pride during the day, fulfilling her duties as a member, then run dozens of kilometers each night to stand guard over her babies. From that night forward, the lioness appeared around the cabin every evening. Mark would watch her through the window, this devoted mother standing sentinel under the moonlight. She couldn't be with her cubs, couldn't hold them or care for them directly, but she could watch over them from the darkness. She could protect them from the dangers that prowled the night. That was all she could do as a mother, and she did it without fail. Every single night, she ran until her body collapsed from exhaustion, then ran again because her babies needed her. A month passed. The cubs had fully recovered, growing energetic and playful inside the cabin. That night, Mark stood by the window as usual, but the lioness didn't appear. Not the next night either, or the night after that. At first, worry consumed him. Had something happened to her? But gradually, Mark realized the truth. She had somehow known that her cubs were safe now, that they no longer needed her nightly protection. She had found a human she could trust, and she had completely entrusted her babies to his care. Mark looked at the sleeping cubs and felt the weight of that trust. They didn't know their mother had protected them every night, but Mark knew, and he would remember for the rest of his life. A year passed. The two male cubs grew into magnificent adults with beautiful white manes. One morning, watching them play outside the cabin, Mark knew what he had to do. No matter how much it hurt, he had to give them their freedom. This was the law of the wild. Because he loved them, he had to let them go. He loaded them into his vehicle one final time and drove deep into the savannah. When he opened the door in the heart of the wilderness, the two lions stepped out slowly, looking back at him with confusion and trust. Mark approached and stroked their heads one last time. The older brother rubbed his face against Mark's hand. The younger leaned against his leg. Mark hugged each lion, feeling their warm bodies, remembering the year they'd spent together. Then he stepped back. "Go now. Walk your own path." The lions stared at him for a long moment before slowly walking toward their future. Mark stood watching until they disappeared beyond the horizon, feeling a piece of his heart go with them. 6 months later, during a routine patrol, Mark's tire blew out in the middle of the desolate savannah. As he knelt to change it, a chill ran down his spine. He turned to see a massive albino male lion standing 20 meters away, the same one he'd driven off 18 months ago. But this lion was different now. His body was covered in fresh wounds and he limped badly. He'd clearly been overthrown, driven from his throne. And now, with no pride to protect, he was free to take his revenge. Mark fired a firecracker, but the lion didn't flinch. He had nothing left to lose. The old lion crouched and began his charge. Against that speed and power, Mark had no chance. He quietly closed his eyes. Then the earth began to shake. 3 lions were running at full speed toward them. Leading was an albino lioness, followed by 2 young males with magnificent white manes. Their roars split the sky. Their footsteps shook the ground. Mark's heart soared. He knew those lions. It was his family. The old male retreated immediately, recognizing he couldn't fight 3 young, strong lions in his weakened state. He glared at Mark one final time before disappearing into the grass. Mark collapsed as his legs gave out. The 3 lions approached slowly. The lioness bowed her head as Mark stroked her with trembling hands. The 2 brothers came to his sides, one resting his head on Mark's shoulder. Mark hugged them tightly, feeling their warmth, marveling at how these tiny cubs had become magnificent adults who had just saved his life. In the distance, a rescue vehicle approached. It was time for them to leave. The lioness raised her head, looked at her sons, then at Mark one last time. "Go well. Stay healthy," Mark whispered. The lioness made a low sound, a farewell. Then they turned and walked away, looking back again and again until they disappeared beyond the horizon. Mark stood smiling through his tears as his colleagues arrived. He had broken the rules that day 18 months ago, but standing there alive, having witnessed love that crossed species, having been part of a family bound not by blood, but by choice and sacrifice, he knew he'd made the right decision. Some principles are worth breaking when life itself hangs in the balance. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe and like. We want to share more touching stories from the savannah with you.